All right. Well, I think that should get us ready to get underway. So thank you for joining us. Still a few people coming in, but really appreciate you joining us for this webinar. So there will be CPD available for this morning, and we'll send those details to you within a week. Just a reminder that all attendees are on mute throughout the session, but you will have every chance to ask questions, and I have Kaz Garrard helping me with questions, and we will bring her in at various points to go through those questions. In asking a question, I request that you use the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat function. So please use the Q&A. All right, let's get into it. This morning, we're going to go through this in some detail. So we're going to cover the background to the education standard and some of the history to the point we've got to. We're going to go through exactly what the government has proposed. We're going to talk through our member survey results. We had something like 530 members respond to a survey, which was an excellent result, highlighting the passion for this particular issue. Talk about what our objectives were in responding, but also what our recommendations were back to the government. And then we're going to spend some time just quickly covering off on what will happen next and where this process will go from here. And we'll have some time for Q&A during the course, but we'll also, I expect, have time at the end. Okay, the education debate. Look, I think we've got to start from the perspective of the fact that we warmly welcome the government's decision late last year to have another look at the education standard, and particularly their commitment to providing more recognition for prior learning and experience. So that was something that we had been calling for a long time, and we certainly welcomed their decision. FACEA came to an end. It ceased to exist from the 1st of January. So from that point, the minister has the ability to make these decisions, whereas she did not have that ability whilst it was under the control of FACEA. Look, in terms of taking over as the CEO of the AFA on the 4th of January this year, this was my first big issue to deal with. And I have to say it was a very challenging issue. It seems that it was going to be very difficult to keep all of our members happy with this particular issue. In fact, if we had have landed at one end of the spectrum versus the other, we would have ended up with half of our members furious with what we've done. Now, in the end, we've landed somewhere in between. And we probably run the risk that we'll have 75% of members unhappy with what we've proposed. But what the purpose of today is to do is to go through exactly what the government has proposed, explain that in some detail, provide some context around the feedback that we've got from members, what we're recommending, so that our members do understand where we're coming from, what we've recommended and why. And that's why this session is really important. Now, I do just want to, at the start, provide a little bit of context around the history of how we've got to this particular point. Some people may have lost context of the extended history of the whole issue of raising education standards. Now, I think it's important that you have some context on that, and I'll go through that relatively quickly. The Ripoll inquiry, which is now over 12 years ago, didn't specifically put an emphasis on education and professional standards, but it did make a recommendation that the government and the regulator should have a look at what should be done to raise standards. ASIC then got more involved through consultation paper 153 back in 2011. So this is more than 10 years ago, where they proposed a new standard for advisors, and that was when they started to talk about an exam and the professional year requirement. But in terms of education, it really kicked off in 2013 when ASIC put out consultation paper 212, and this specifically referred to the education standard for financial advisors. And in amongst those recommendations was the suggestion that the standard, which had been a diploma standard to that point, should be raised in 2015 to an advanced diploma of financial planning, and then in 2019 to a degree. Now, ASIC was suggesting that new standard should apply to all new advisors and any existing advisor who chose to change the area in which they practiced. So if, for example, they went from being a generalist to an SMSF specialist, ASIC was suggesting that the new higher education standard would apply. So that's going back to 2013. 2014, there were a series of inquiries that took place. There was a Senate inquiry into the performance of ASIC and the issues that happened within Commonwealth financial planning. There was also the financial system inquiry, and then the Parliamentary Joint Committee inquiry into lifting professional standards in financial services. Each of those inquiries recommended raising education standards, and in particular the suggestion that there should be a degree requirement. And then in 2015, the government responded to all of those inquiries, indicating their support for raising professional standards in financial advice and putting a package of reforms that was ultimately legislated in February of 2017. So there is a long history in the lead up to this of input and discussion, and then ultimately government commitment to raising standards in financial advice. Now, some of you probably mightn't remember the sort of environment that we existed in 2014. 2014 started with a relatively positive tone, because in late 2013, the new Liberal government, coalition government, announced that they were going to make reforms to FOFA, to amend FOFA. But as the year progressed, there was this huge pushback against any suggestion of changes to FOFA. We had the Senate inquiry into ASIC and Commonwealth financial planning. We had the financial system inquiry. And then in October, we had the release of ASIC Report 413 on life insurance. But I'm just plucking out an example of a news story from that time. Cheating rife in financial planning, and discussion at that time was common about referring to financial advice being a sector where you could be qualified within 4 days, and this reference to the training standard being lower than for hairdressers. So this was all part of the environment that led to the decision of the government to push through professional standards for financial advisors. And it just does provide some context that this has been a process of reform for some period of time. Now, I want to talk about what position that the AFA has had along that journey. We have long supported higher education standards. Specifically, we were saying some time ago that it should be a degree for new advisors. But the contentious issue has always been what should apply to existing advisors and what the transition model should be. Now, we did acknowledge it was reasonable in the context of all that criticism about financial advice, and which I've referred to. You can be qualified in 4 days. We had senators saying they could come off the shearing shed floor, do 4 days of education, and be recommending people how they invest their retirement savings. So we did acknowledge that there needed to be an increase in education standards. And in 2014, we suggested that most sensible solution was that existing advisors would have a transition period under which they needed to complete the Advanced Diploma of Financial Planning. So ultimately, the legislation to enact the professional standards reforms was passed in February of 2017. Now, I'm going to touch on this in just a moment, but the legislation was not particularly clear on what the implications should be for existing advisors. We'll go through some of the specific statements in the explanatory memorandum to that bill shortly, but it was vague enough that there was reason for us to be concerned. And then ultimately in December of 2017, FASEA put out their first consultation paper on the education standard, and for the first time signalled that they expected that the default standard would be an 8-subject graduate diploma for existing advisors. And that is an AQF level 8 qualification. So I might just quickly refresh what AQF 8 means and the whole AQF framework. So basically a diploma is an AQF 5 level, an advanced diploma is AQF 6, undergraduate AQF 7, and then as you go above into postgraduate, you've got a graduate certificate, and that's only 4 subjects as opposed to a graduate diploma, which is 8 subjects. So that provides some context, and then a master's degree is AQF 9, which is obviously virtually the highest level that you can get to. So yes, we're going from what the existing standard was as a diploma, obviously with the intent that it would get higher, but the question is, where was it going to land? There were a range of options. We certainly didn't anticipate FASEA was going to suggest a graduate diploma, but that is exactly what they suggested back in late 2017. So since December 2017, we've been living in the context of the clear knowledge that it was FASEA, an independent body set up by the government, who would make the decision with respect to the education standard. And that was the regime that was in play until the 1st of January this year, where we've now seen the responsibility for setting standards passed back to the government, and the minister can now make these decisions. So as we worked through our response to FASEA back in 2018, we actually ran a town hall campaign around the country to discuss this with our members. We put forward this idea that there could be a solution where experienced older advisors, 55 plus, could have access to a 4-subject graduate certificate, but we had at that time suggested that there would be a need for a sunset clause. Later in 2018, in our response, our final response to FASEA before they enacted the education standard, we proposed a solution where there would be a recognition for experience, and I'm saying a recognition for experience as a proxy for earlier courses and CPD, because the legislation specifically said that there was no direct ability to recognise experience, but instead to recognise the CPD that had been done during those years of experience. So we had suggested that anyone with 15 plus years experience should get 3 subjects credit, anyone between 10 and 15 should get 2 subjects, and anyone with more than 5 years should get 1 subject credit. Now, it's important to note that this recommendation was on top of any other credit that advisors would have got for ADFP, for a professional designation, for a non-relevant degree. So it would effectively build up your credit so that you would be much closer to the objective rather than the starting point, which at that time was clearly going to be 8 subjects at the graduate diploma level. And this is the position that we've continued to argue with both FASEA, the government, and we've talked to the minister about our concerns about the education standard a number of times, and also a range of other politicians who were interested in looking at this issue and were concerned about the impact that the FASEA standards were going to have on experienced advisors, and particularly those who were older, for whom an investment in education had a much smaller payback period. Now, I did say before I was going to take you back and explain some of the things that was said in the explanatory memorandum to that bill in 2017. I've just pulled out a few of the paragraphs from that explanatory memorandum. 6.8 refers to the ability to allow flexibility for existing providers, and flexibility is something that we really never felt that we got. And they made it clear that existing providers were not required to do a 3-year degree. 6.9 goes on to say that the new law explicitly states that courses undertaken before the new law commences must be taken into consideration. The body, being FASEA, may take into account diploma or degree courses, licensee training courses, or CPD. And as we know, the diploma courses were never taken into account. It was only the ADFP, although the DFP 1 to 8 with the extra 4 subjects was taken into account, and there was never any recognition for CPD. And then 6.11 specifically addresses this issue of experience, saying that whilst they would not expect experience to be taken into account, the fact that an advisor had been in the industry for a longer period of time meant they'd completed more CPD, and therefore the expectation was that they would get more credit for it. So these are some of the things that the explanatory memorandum to the bill referred to, and obviously that's quite critical because that's what the intent of the Parliament was. And this is why you will have seen over the years questions being raised of FASEA at things like Senate estimates about why they hadn't given more recognition for prior learning and experience. And for some of you, you might remember Senator Amanda Stoker and the questions that she asked a couple of times of FASEA back 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a little bit of the history. I just want to emphasise, in June 2018, as part of our consultation with members and as part of the response to FASEA at that time, we identified our principles, and our principles that were dictating what we were taking forward as our position. Now, we fully acknowledged the importance of lifting education standards to regain trust. And obviously in June of 2018, that was a couple of months after financial advice had been on the stand at the Royal Commission. And we fully acknowledged that there was work that needed to be done to regain that trust. We also wanted to ensure that there was equity in that whatever the end outcome was, it fairly recognised all previous study. And I mean all previous study, not just those that had been done more recently, such as the ADFP or professional designations. We wanted to avoid a mass exodus, which I guess the reality suggests that we've lived to see, but at this stage, mostly driven by the exam, but obviously the concern and anxiety about the education standard has been a factor in the departure of many advisors over the last couple of years. And another important point was we wanted to ensure that this, whatever further study advisors needed to do, delivered value. And that meant that it needed to be study in an area of interest to them, and if they're a specialist, in an area that they were specialising in, so that they could actually get value from it, not just the perception or the reality of doing subjects because that was mandated and everyone had to do the same thing. We wanted value, and that meant more flexibility. Now, I just want to emphasise the issue of being a profession. I think if I was to ask everyone on this webinar who agrees that we want financial advice to be recognised as a profession, I think I get a pretty strong majority of people want that outcome. So I just want to go through a key part of the definition of a profession. And this comes from the Australian Council of Professions. A profession is a disciplined group of individuals who adhere to ethical standards and who hold themselves out as and are accepted by the public as possessing special knowledge and skills in a widely recognised body of learning derived from research, education and training at a high level. So there's that strong emphasis on education and training at a high level. And why do we think it's important that financial advice is recognised as a profession? Well, I think it contributes to trust in the profession, but it also contributes to the fact that if we're recognised as a profession, then the Parliament needs to treat us as a profession. And in that, they need to move away from this incredibly prescriptive regulatory regime that we exist within and allow more recognition of professional judgment, more like the other professions get, whether that's law, accounting or medicine. You know, a doctor recommending a medical procedure does not produce a statement of advice, and that is reflective of the fact that they are recognised as being professionals. So let's now move on to what the government proposed. Now, I have to acknowledge that Stephen Jones, the Shadow Minister, first put a proposal out on the 8th of December, and within 8 days, the government had come back. This is very close to Christmas. It was a huge announcement that obviously we'd been wanting to see some movement in this area, but this was certainly a big surprise for us. So they proposed 2 new pathways, an experience pathway and a qualification pathway. Now, the experience pathway was defined as any existing advisor with 10 years or more experience as at 1 January 2026, and that was 10 out of the last 12. And I'll come back to the issues around 10 out of the last 12 with a clean record, and we'll come back to what that means. They would only need to do the Code of Ethics subject. Now, we've had a look at the Financial Advisor Register, and if you exclude those advisors who first started providing advice in 2016, 2017 and 2018, and let me just say, there's a very small number who have started providing advice since 2019, and they are already going to be education standard compliant. So we only look at 2016, 17 and 18. They're the ones that wouldn't qualify for this. So if we exclude those, we reckon there's about 75% of existing advisors who would fit within this existing advisor pathway. So that's the first one, and we'll come back to talk about the different elements of that as we progress through. The other one is a qualification pathway. Now, this means that someone would have needed to have completed a bachelor's degree or higher with at least 8 units in a related field of study, and the proposal paper listed those 15 areas of study. The units could be across a single or multiple qualifications, and existing advisors would be limited to having 2 subjects credit as per the FASEA RPL policy. Now, at the moment, FASEA has a policy of recognising things like an ADFP, a professional designation, 4 to 7 subjects in a relevant degree or a non-relevant degree. There's a number of different criteria to be recognised. But for some reason, the government has restricted that to 2 subjects credit. So there are different issues that will apply to people if they were to rely upon this qualification pathway. Now, the qualification pathway could apply to both new and existing advisors, and therefore it is important that it's not just new advisors that we're reflecting on. The consequences of it are really quite broad. The FASEA approved courses list would disappear. So no longer would we have courses that have been approved by FASEA, whether that's Kaplan or Deakin or Griffith or University of Western Sydney. We'd no longer have that. and it would open it up to universities, other universities that haven't sought the approval of FASEA. But it would place a lot more emphasis on licensees and individual advisors to make sure that they complied with the responsibilities of the education standard. Now, I might just pause it, might just go to this next slide and then we'll pause it for questions. I just want to come back to this issue of a clean record. So what does it actually mean? So the single disciplinary body started on the 1st of January of this year, and we heard last week that 31 people have been appointed to the Financial Services and Credit Panel. And those panels will consider disciplinary matters that come in front of them. Now, ASIC can ban people, and in which case, obviously, it would appear obvious that they wouldn't any longer meet that experience pathway criteria, because a banning would not represent a clean record. But otherwise, if you ended up in front of the Financial Services and Credit Panel, you ended up with a prohibition or a suspension, then obviously your experience pathway would no longer be valid. But there are other penalties of a lower scale that would also lead to you being disqualified. So you might end up with a sanction that involves the requirement to undertake specified training, or receive counselling, or be subject to supervision, or be required to report matters to ASIC. Any of those sanctions would mean that you would no longer be qualified to leverage that experience pathway. The government did make it clear in their policy paper that written warnings or reprimands would not be covered in this disqualification provision, but there are some that are. And the point is, and the point that we really emphasise, was that if you ended up in 2025 being the subject of a complaint that ends up with the Financial Services and Credit Panel, and you ended up getting a sanction requiring you to undertake some further training at the end of 2025, then you wouldn't have the ability, you wouldn't have the time to go back and do the study that might be required to meet the qualification pathway. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. Kaz, I might just stop there. Are there questions that you think are appropriate to raise at this point?
Well, we have one question where someone's asked about, do we have any idea when a decision may be reached on the new education requirements?
So, Kaz, I'll come to that in the last slide. And we are hoping that this will be resolved before the government goes to the election this year, but I'll talk more about that in a moment.
Okay. No other questions at the moment.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's keep pushing on. What I want to do now is I want to share with members, and this was within our submission, so it has already been made public, but the results that we got from the survey we did of members. The first question was around what's your current status, and pleasingly 30% suggested that they had already met the FASEA education standard, and another 33% were making good progress towards it. 15% had not started, however they intended to, and interestingly 20% had indicated that they did not intend to undertake any further study. And I think this is the group that we see as the opportunity. If there is more reasonable recognition of prior learning and experience, then this is the group who may change their mind and decide to do some further study in order to stay in the profession. So that in many ways is what the opportunity is here. Now, the next question is, how would you classify your education status before having commenced further study? And 11% had a FASEA approved degree, combination of relevant and relevant degree with other exemptions. 56% had some exemptions, and 15% had no exemptions and would be required to do the full 8 subjects. And I guess that's the group that is most interested in this recognition of prior learning and experience. We also asked a set of questions, and I think this is really pivotal, that across everyone we asked what level of, what's your view on whether FASEA provided adequate recognition for prior learning and experience? And 75.5% disagreed and said that FASEA did not provide adequate recognition. Interestingly, 20% thought they did. We looked at the question of, would you support an increased level of recognition for prior learning and experience? 74.7% said yes. So there is overwhelming support for more recognition of prior learning and experience. And I think that's a positive message out of this, that 3 out of 4 of our members believe that providing more appropriate recognition is the right thing to do. We asked then the question about whether they supported the government's proposal, and over 50% said yes. Importantly, there was 25% who support increased recognition of prior learning and experience, but feel that the government went too far in going from requiring 8 subjects to requiring 1 subject. And then those who support the existing FASEA model, it was 18%. Okay, we asked those who opposed the experience pathway to explain what their reasons were. 22% said that they thought that it undermined recognition of financial advice as a profession. And there was a group of 8% who rightly said, well, I've already done the work. I got in there early and have done the work, so this is unfair. And there is another group who said that we need to lift the minimum standard and everyone should have to do further study. Now, there was a really important question around whether the 10-year test should apply at the end of this transition period, as opposed to some who thought it should start at the beginning. And that's the difference between whether 75% would be covered by it or a much reduced number. Now, interestingly, 56% thought that 10 years should apply at the 1st of January 2026, but a significant number thought that that was probably too late on. Okay, so next question is, if the government does go ahead with this reform as they have proposed, what should it look like? 49% said exactly as the government has proposed. 15% said maybe it should be a graduate certificate with access to exemptions. 20% said that the existing model should be the way forward, but with more recognition for prior learning and experience, and 15% said they do not support any change. Now, in this particular slide, I'm looking at the comparison of the question of support for increased RPL versus what their current education status is. And for those people who are already compliant with the FASEA education standard, that's where you see the lowest support for increased RPL. So 48% support for increased RPL from that group, going all the way up to 96% for that group who do not intend to undertake any further study. So this is interesting in showing the support differs across the different segments. And lastly, in terms of these questions that we put for members, comparing their support for the government proposal with their current education status. And obviously, I've not started, however, I intend to meet the FASEA education standard. This group is very strongly in favour of the government's proposal. But I also found it quite interesting to see that of the group who do not intend to undertake any further study, 22% of them thought that the government had gone too far. So I think all of this paints the message that there's a diversity of opinions amongst the member base. It's to some extent close to being split 50-50, although our numbers suggest that it's more than 50% in favour of what the government has proposed. But certainly some of the emotion and passion behind those who oppose it is particularly strong. Kaz, just might quickly stop for any questions on the survey results.
There's no questions on the survey results.
All right, well, we'll keep pushing on then with what our objectives were and what our recommendations were. So in framing the AFA's response to this submission, we identified 6 criteria or objectives. They were advisor numbers. We want to see a sensible retention of as many appropriately qualified financial advisors as possible. We want financial advice to remain accessible and affordable for everyday Australians. And that's not going to be the case if financial advisor numbers continue to decline. We've also said it's important that we retain recognition of financial advice as a profession. We do not want this outcome to undermine that recognition. We don't want to go back to where we were in 2014 or 2018. We support an ongoing commitment to learning. I think that's part of being a profession. We also support the continuation of the academic community that has got behind financial advice and has put courses together. They've invested in financial advice. They are working to get people coming through that create the future of financial advice. So we don't want them to be undermined as a result of this. Also importantly, we want to ensure that the people who are the leaders in this profession in 5 or 10 years' time don't look back at what happened in 2022 with regret. We have to reach an outcome where they believe that we did reach a sensible compromise that played to the interests of the profession as a whole, both short-term and long-term. And we also want to see that the core knowledge areas that will be necessary to define who should be in this profession in the future are defined as part of this process. So they are the core objectives that led our thinking. Now I'm going to take you through what our recommendations were. We were very conscious at the outset that we didn't want anyone to be disadvantaged as a result of this. And that might mean anyone who doesn't qualify for the experience pathway that needed to go through the qualification pathway. We didn't want them to be in a worse position. We also wanted to make sure that people who had committed to go down this pathway and had undertaken the study could continue to complete the study that they had already commenced if that was their choice, so that those FASEA options remained available to them. Now, in looking at the experience pathway, we decided to define this in terms of we still wanted an outcome where we could argue that all advisors were tertiary qualified. Now, the easiest way to do that was to say that the standard was a graduate certificate, a 4-subject graduate certificate, but for people who had more experience, they would be subject to more credit for that. So we said for someone who had 20 years experience, they should get 2 subjects credit. So they would need to do 2 subjects. Now, I acknowledge that that is 1 more subject than the government has stipulated, but by doing just 1 more subject, you would come out of it with a qualification being a graduate certificate, which is a genuine qualification, rather than just completing 1 subject and having a transcript that has 1 subject on it. You come out of it with a qualification. And that's why we've argued for this. We've said that that means that we can stand up and say financial advice is a profession. All advisors are tertiary qualified. and we deserve to be treated as a profession. We've said for someone with 15 years but less than 20 years, they should get 1 subject credit, so they would need to do 3 subjects. For someone with more than 10 years experience, they should have access to the 4 subject graduate certificate. Now, keep in mind that those who are in a better position based upon the FACEA pathway should still be able to do that. Now, importantly, we have said that we did not support the clean record requirement, but in lieu of that, we thought that a higher education standard, and that's like being required to do 2 subjects rather than 1, would justify removing that, because that removes the confusion between what the education standard is and what the conduct expectations are. But equally, it addresses the fact that someone could get caught out by this by having a complaint raised against them, ending up in front of a panel, and in late 2025, finding they get a sanction, and all of a sudden they're no longer eligible for that pathway. When it comes to the qualification pathway, we believe it's appropriate that there are specified core knowledge areas, and if someone has gone through a university program and does not meet those core knowledge areas, and the way it's proposed at the moment, you could just do 8 accounting subjects or 8 law subjects, and you would technically have met the standard. We think there needs to be core knowledge areas that relate to financial advice. So for someone who hasn't done those core knowledge areas, we've suggested there should be a bridging course that's required. We've also said that we don't agree with that cap of 2 exemptions for this pathway. And that's people who have done the ADFP and a professional designation, or they've already done 4 to 7 relevant subjects, or they've done a non-relevant degree. Why cap it at 2? We've said either remove it or increase it to 4. And then when it comes to new entrants, we are particularly concerned about the low flow of new advisors into the profession. And we've said that more needs to be done to encourage employers to appoint new professional year candidates. And maybe we need to have some sort of apprenticeship model where the government contributes to the funding of those new entrants. Now, I'm just going to also talk about some other key things in our recommendations. As I said, we're not opposed to higher professional standards, and I know it might sound counterintuitive to oppose that clean record requirement, but at this stage, we don't know how many sanctions will be handed out by the FSCP or for what reasons. Is it going to be a relatively minor matter that ends up in front of a panel? Maybe it relates to a complaint where the complainant has a different version of events to what the advisor's perception is. So look, we just think that's a little bit of an unknown, and also we're really conscious that if you get a sanction in 2022, then you've got at least 3 years to respond to it. But if you got a sanction against your name at the end of 2025, you've run out of time to undertake the qualification pathway. We've also opposed the 10 years full-time experience out of the last 12 years. We just don't know why it's necessary to link it back to the last 12 years. And in our response, we've used specific examples. If you work 4 days a week for 12 years, 4 days a week for 12 years is 9.6 years full-time. That wouldn't qualify. How is it the intent that people who've worked part-time for 12 years, 4 days a week, should not qualify for this experience pathway? And what about those who have taken maternity leave over the course of the last 12 years? Even short periods off for maternity leave, if you've come back on a part-time basis, when that's all added up, may mean that people would not qualify. And we certainly don't want to see mothers who have taken time off for maternity leave and return to work part-time to be disadvantaged. And look, we've put a little bit of emphasis in our submission on how we might be able to change the PY model to make it easier for businesses to appoint professional year candidates. That's going to be key to the future. You know, we're not getting enough new advisors in. We've got to get more who come in. They've got to want to do advice. They've got to work their way through the university program, and then there've got to be opportunities for them once they have finished. Now, I want to quickly talk about some other submissions. You know, in terms of our response, there have been a number of other professional associations who have taken a similar stance in welcoming the government's efforts to look at this, but just questioning whether the balance is right. So I'll take you through 3 examples. One said that this issue should be addressed as part of the quality of advice review, or alternatively, it should only be available to advisors who have 55 years or older, as at the 1st of January this year, who have 15 out of the last 20 years experience, but subject to a 10-year sunset clause. Another professional association said that the experience criteria should only be available for those who have done 20 years out of the last 25. Another said that it should apply to advisors with 10 years as at 1 January this year, and have some other criteria that would apply to them. Now, we feel that what we have put forward as a proposal is a very sensible compromise that holds on to that recognition of financial advice as a profession and the fact that everyone should be able to claim that they're tertiary qualified, but at the same time adequately provides recognition for prior learning and experience. Now, I know what we've proposed is not going to be warmly welcomed by everyone, and that's why we've had this session to talk through the rationale for it and why we're happy to answer questions. But look, I just want to cover off next steps. The really important thing about this is that this does not require legislation. This does not require the Parliament to do anything. It can be implemented by the Minister. However, 2022 is an election year, and we want this to be resolved before the election. The last possible date for an election is the 21st of May. They need to have the election before then so that the new Senate can be in place from the 1st of July. You need to have a certain period of time before an election to call the election. There's a minimum campaign period, and that means the election must be called by the 18th of April. The government cannot enact a legislative instrument whilst they're in campaign mode. So any change to the education standard would need to be enacted before Easter, assuming the election is on the 21st of May. So that is our hope. We do want to see this resolved. We want advisors to have certainty. We want them to be able to get on and do what they need to do, but they need to know exactly what they must do. And we are concerned about hearing that a number of people certainly have put their study on pause because of this process. We need to get it resolved sooner rather than later. So at that point, Kaz, over to you for any questions.
Okay. So thank you for the answer about when the decision might be reached, Phil. One of the questions that's come through is talking about, since FASEA is now merged with, is part of Treasury, are we seeing any difference in relation to the AFA's consultation with Treasury as opposed to what the consultation was like between the AFA and FACEA?
Well, good question, but I think it's too early to suggest that we've got proof of the outcome there. And the minister now has the ability to make these decisions. The process of reform is that it will go through the Treasury Department. This is the first consultation on changes to the standards. So we will await how the government responds to this. We're also hoping that there will be change in terms of the Code of Ethics. We certainly haven't given up hope on changes to Standard 3 and other parts of the Code of Ethics. And we were pleased to hear that the Minister made comments quite recently about the CPD standard. And you know, we continue to have an issue with the requirement that every year advisors need to spend 9 hours on professionalism and ethics. So we would love to see that be looked at. But look, it's too early to say whether there's going to be a change. We certainly expect there to be a different approach to consultation. But ask me that question again later in the year.
When do you think Treasury might release the public submissions to the education proposal?
Historically, we have seen that Treasury don't release the submissions until the end of the process, until there's an outcome. You know, other parties release them earlier, and certainly Senate inquiries or parliamentary inquiries, you get to see submissions almost immediately. Treasury don't do that, and we'll have to wait and see when they release them.
Okay. Why do you think we would need to complete the Code of Ethics course when we've already completed the FACEA exam?
Look, the government has, in their proposal paper, stipulated that everyone would need to do a Code of Ethics subject, and I think that the government holds on to that as they see that as part of becoming a profession, and obviously it's something that the consumer groups would expect. I appreciate the question. If you've already done the exam, why should you do that subject? And you know, my thinking about it is people probably should have done that subject before they did the exam, because it would help them with the exam. The exam doesn't just cover the Code of Ethics, and it's an exam as opposed to a course. I think we need to accept that wherever we land, that subject will be a requirement. So I think that's just one of the givens that we have to work with.
So a question now on what the AFA has outlined in its recommendation. The question is, would the ethics subject be in addition to what the AFA has recommended?
Oh, no, definitely not. You know, when we said 2 subjects for someone with more than 20 years experience, one of them would be the Code of Ethics subject. In our submission, we said the other subject should be the legislative regulatory obligations subject. That's already one of the bridging courses. You know, in hindsight, we probably would pull back from that, because if someone's already done another subject but they haven't done those obligations subject, then we would want that to count. So we're definitely not saying you should need to do a Code of Ethics subject on top of the 2 subjects that we've stipulated. But it would be problematic if you've already done other subjects but not the Code of Ethics subject, because the government clearly sees that as a core subject.
Someone has asked a question about to what degree do the various professional bodies discuss these types of joint submissions? So, for example...
Okay, so I mean, there are no joint submissions that I'm aware of, but I think that there are ongoing and regular conversations with the other professional associations. So, you know, we talked to other professional associations about where we were heading with this. We emphasised the fact that we want to get an outcome from this process. We don't want it deferred. We think that we need certainty moving forward. There's been extensive discussions. Look, I think the message I'd say is that with probably one or two exceptions, the professional associations all thought that there was a need to move in this area, but probably it was about finding the right balance. We're probably clearer and more definitive in what our model looks like than maybe some of the others, but there was lots of consultation and we knew where other people stood in terms of their thinking on this issue.
Could we just recap what the government has proposed in relation to the two pathways? So one being the experience pathway and one being the qualification pathway, because there's a few questions where people have completed historic courses and they have the years of experience requirement, and there seems to be some confusion over how many subjects they might be required to do.
Okay.
Could we just
let's
that?
Yeah, thanks, Kaz. So they are two very separate pathways, and there's no crossover. So you've got the experience pathway, and someone going through the experience pathway would need to have 10 years experience out of the last 12 years as at 1 January 2026. So that's 4 years' time, and they would have to have a clean record. Now, there'll be certain people who won't qualify for that because you know, they may have worked part-time or taken time out, taken a break, work maybe in another role for a period of time. They'll have to meet the qualification pathway. And anyone who has any sanction from the FSCP before 1 January 2026 would also not be eligible. The qualification pathway is that you need to have completed a qualification at undergraduate level or higher, such as a degree or a graduate diploma that included 8 subjects that fit within 15 fields that would be classified as business related, including financial planning subjects. And so if you've done a financial planning degree or you've done a graduate diploma or you've done a master's degree, then you would readily meet those criteria. If you had not completed 8 subjects, then you could do further subjects as part of your education between now and 1 January 26 to get to the point that you had completed 8 qualifying subjects. Now, with that qualification pathway, the government had proposed that there would be access to up to 2 exemptions for the FACEA recognition of prior learning, which is ADFP, professional designation, and so on. So if you did qualify for that, you'd need to do 6 subjects, or you'd need to have done 6 subjects in the past. It might be a good idea, Kaz, for those specific questions for us to take those offline.
Yes, agreed. Maybe just one last question, because we're at time. If these reforms aren't in place and if there is a change of government, then what do you think what do you think might happen to those reforms?
Okay, so I think we can take a level of comfort from the fact that the Shadow Minister also made a proposal. And if you go back to his presentation at our conference in September last year, he was talking about better recognition of RPL. So he's been thinking about this for a while. In December, he made the announcement. The government also made an announcement. So I think we can be reasonably confident that there will be change in this space. The problem we see is the more it's delayed, the more the uncertainty is created, people putting off their study, the less time they have available to complete that study. So I'm not saying in any way that if it's not resolved before the election, that it won't be resolved in terms of a much better recognition of prior learning. My concern is that, will it be a priority of a new government? What might the timing be? You know, might it not be until much later in this year that it would be resolved if it's not resolved before the election? And that's why I'm saying I would prefer to see this resolved sooner rather than later, so we have certainty and advisors can make that decision. And I'm really hoping that those who have made the decision not to do further study will reconsider that and choose to stay on. So I want those people to have the certainty that they know what the situation is, and they can go back and reconsider that decision that they may have already made. All right, so Kaz, I'll move on now to the final slide. Thank you for those questions, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. Today's webinar will be recorded, the slides will be available, and for anyone who hasn't watched it or hasn't watched it has only part watched it, you'll be able to relook at it and do a CPD assessment quiz. All registrants will receive an email confirming when available. And if you do have any questions, then please get in touch through info@afa.asn.au. So let me thank you again. Look, I think what I set out to do today, I understood that this was a really challenging subject. I didn't expect that everyone would be happy with what we have proposed, but the purpose of today was to ensure that members understood exactly what has been proposed. They understood exactly what the AFA had recommended and why, and I hope that we have achieved that objective. So thank you very much for being part of it today.